Welcome back to this As of Yet Unnamed podcast, or what I lovingly call Ayun. And today's topic that I intend to vomit out on is the totally non-controversial subject of Subhash Chandra Bose and how his alliances were questionable at best. Well, I wish I could, but I live in India and I love having a head on my shoulders. But what we can talk about is how his alliance led to many Indians who look and sound just like me noticeably not having their heads on their shoulders anymore. Well, it's time to talk about Japan and its atrocities on Indians. And that's not something you hear every day. Anyways, if you are the average Indian, your perception of Japan is certainly shaped by what the American empire wants you to believe and what the Japanese certainly think is best for the world to believe about them. Today, you may know them more for their resolve to get back up from disasters like the tsunamis, the earthquakes, and the OG apocalypse that was the nuclear bombings of two major cities in Japan. What we seem to forget most of the time is that there is a very good reason that America decided to drop those bombs on this seemingly sweet anime loving country. That being, they had new weapons and a very short window of time to try it out. Well, apart from that, the Japanese were a terrifying force to stand against in the battlefield. Not particularly because of their weapons or industrial might, which were substantial to say the least without undercutting it, but more so because of the ferocity with which these soldiers had been indoctrinated. Japanese soldiers were notorious for conducting death charges during the war. These are suicidal attacks onto the enemy positions when a unit seemed to have run out of ammunition and supplies, which is a last ditch attempt not to save their own lives, mind you, but to safeguard their country's honor and by extension the god emperor's honor. Now, while these are qualities that someone who's a hyper-nationalist might find adorable, I think I should make it clear that dying for a piece of land when there are certainly other better options that end up with you showing up to your family alive and not in a box is an extremely stupid thing to do. However, when we talk about these soldiers of the Imperial Army, we are not just talking about indoctrinated young men, but men who have seen war since the 30s and have taken part in several gut-wrenching atrocities throughout this time. So, a lot of men desensitized to death with the fundamental belief that they were superior human beings, which is something we don't talk about enough. While the Nazis in World War II are certainly and deservedly hammered for their racist beliefs that led them to commit atrocities like the Holocaust, the Japanese held more or less those very same beliefs, but it was against Asian people, so the West just seemed to agree on it. We were coming up with classifications of our own. Thank you for cutting down our labor. That's the best I can do of a Western accent, and it's some sort of British and American hybrid. I don't know. So the Empire of Japan at this point is more like Homelander in the sense that they are more powerful than most nations on the planet. And that leads them to believe that they are superior to most other humans on the planet as well. And as we know with Homelander, that's not the case. There eventually comes a bigger fish, and in this case, the bigger fish was the entire American empire. Japan invaded China in 1937 and put a start to the Second Sino-Japanese War. In a way, the very first conflict of World War II, but again, zero white people involved, so the world didn't care. Anyways, the core idea of the Japanese army was that they were just a racially superior force to these Chinese people they were trying to subjugate. And the early easy victories by the Japanese and the constant retreating and desertion from the Chinese side just strengthened those very wrong beliefs they held. It is important to understand that unlike Japan, which had a strong top-down identity of nationhood by this time, China was undergoing an identity crisis of the century or the millennia, I don't know. See, since the mid-19th century, the imperial hold over China as a whole was ever weakening. From civil rebellions to international invasions, not limited to but including the Japanese, the Americans, the Russians and the British, the ruling dynasty of China, that is the Qing dynasty, was certainly on its very last legs. What followed the collapse of nearly 2,000 years of mostly uninterrupted imperial rule was a brief period of warlord domination that eventually resulted in the Republic of China being established under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. This too didn't last long, as there was another civil war, this time between Kuomintang forces, that is Chiang Kai-shek's forces, and Mao Zedong's communists. This was a divided nation that Japan invaded, which made rapid advancement by Japanese troops into mainland China very much possible and surprisingly easy. So with an invading army, their wartime atrocities followed. And these are atrocities that Japan has mostly not acknowledged to this day. And I do not wish to go into detail about these atrocities since there are horrendous war crimes committed against our own people that we are left to cover, which more or less will give you a rough idea about the overall brutality of the Imperial Japanese Army. But I personally cannot move forward after mentioning China during this time and not going over the Nanjing massacre or the rape of Nanking. See, this was the capital city of the then Chinese Republic. However, it was clearly indefensible after the fall of Shanghai. So, in order to avoid losing good soldiers in a very symbolic fight, most of the troops just withdrew while a few thousand untrained men were sent to the front lines. Now, the Japanese stormed through these lines and had taken over Nanking in no time. The only place where the citizens of Nanking could find any sort of refuge was inside the safety zone created by a Western businessman, journalists, under a German national and a Nazi party member, John Raab. So you can imagine how bad things need to be for a Nazi to be a beacon of hope. Anyways, these efforts managed to shield nearly 2 lakh Chinese citizens from the wrath of the invading forces. However, for everyone left outside of that safety zone, it would have been the closest humanity got to being under siege by the forces of hell itself. Many survivors' testimonies do exist to this day, and I would like to read out one of them by a man named Zhu Shisheng. Zhu was a 22-year-old at the time and worked with his elderly father as a junk collector. He described his first-hand experience of Japanese brutality in one of the several refugee camps around Nanking as such. Quote, "One afternoon near 4 o'clock, the Japanese soldiers came to arrest people. I pretended to be ill and laid on the ground covered with a quilt. I showed them a certificate issued by the refugee shelter. The Japanese soldiers tore it up without even looking. They took me and 2 other men to the river, and when we got to the river, the other 2 were hacked to death by the Japanese soldiers. Then a Japanese soldier wanted to kill me. I begged them, saying I had to support my family and take care of my old man. I used gestures out of fear that they would not understand me. As I was speaking, 3 more Japanese soldiers came, and before I could see them, one of them hacked me on the back of my neck. I fell to the ground. I still had some consciousness at that time, and because I was wearing a torn overcoat, I bit my collar, holding my breath to pretend to be dead. After a few minutes, the Japanese soldiers kicked me with their feet, but I pretended to be dead and didn't move. Then they said something to the effect of dead and left. The death toll estimates of civilians and stranded Chinese soldiers went up to nearly 3 lakhs, while the instances of rape and violence against women and children were far too many to count. Women would be taken in by the Japanese as comfort women, a sleazy way to say that they were forced into prostitution. Many women were assaulted by soldiers who took turns until their victim was left nearly lifeless, and at this point, many of them were killed in order to avoid them filing any sort of complaints if that was even a possibility at the time. In this too, the Japanese showed extraordinary levels of cruelty, with many women meeting their end at the tip of Imperial Army bayonets. Again, not by rifles, but by bayonets. They had their insides pulled out by the Japanese soldiers once they were done with them. Chinese soldiers who were promised amnesty if they laid down their arms were instead taken by the river and shot or stabbed. Quote, "The river ran red," said locals who witnessed this massacre and survived. Now, these events have been portrayed in the Christian Bale movie Flowers of War, which is a joint effort, I think, between Hollywood and the CCP. To ensure that these things are remembered by a generation to come. And if you want to know more about the Nanking massacre and not do boring things such as read, watch this movie. It's a good base to start your research on or something. So arguments still run wild on how much culpability the senior ranks of the army and the imperial family held in these acts, as in were they ordered by them or just a spur of the moment decision taken by thousands of soldiers. The general who led the charge into Nanking, however, was Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the son-in-law of Japan's former emperor Meiji and the uncle of its current monarch Hirohito. So, I guess you can decide the rest for yourself. It is important to remember that the root cause for this banal approach towards ending human life for sport is their fundamental belief that they were a superior race, and these same feelings were held by the Japanese towards every other country in Asia, including India. In the period before World War I and up to 1945, Buddhism had been suppressed in Japan, placing more emphasis on the emperor as a godlike figure. Now, this was because the religion originated in India and traveled to Japan through China, 2 nations that Japanese considered to be inferior. And this is a problem that many modern Hindu nationalists fail to realize when they identify with fascistic movements of the mid-20th century. Because you would have been on the trains and in the camps by my side by virtue of the color of your skin alone. There's no changing that. These institutions fundamentally viewed at us as inferiors, even more so than the British did in some cases. And unlike the British who wished to subjugate the so-called inferior races labor, the Axis were mostly focusing on dehumanization and extermination. Regardless, since Subhash Chandra Bose had already been in contact with the Germans, as Japan gained ground throughout Southeastern Asia, it was only logical for him to ally himself with these anti-British forces. They came to an arrangement that would see Indian POWs working under the British Raj would have the option to switch alliances and join the Azad Hind Sena or the Indian National Army instead of like being shipped off to some faraway holding camp. Now, of the 40,000 Indian soldiers that came into Japanese custody at the fall of Singapore, three-fourths of them volunteered for the Azad Hind Sena. The 10,000 that were left behind, well, they were the very first natives of the subcontinent to find out how the Japanese really felt about our people when the mask of a feeble alliance wore off. As these prisoners were shipped off from Singapore to more remote holding stations in the general Oceania region, the transport was the appropriate introduction to the hell that they were ultimately being brought to. 2 to 3,000 prisoners who were already severely undernourished and at risk of contracting diseases were crammed together at the bottom of the deck, with the officers and doctors in these units being given explicit orders not to treat their fellow men on the off chance like they were ever supplied with the necessary equipment at the start. Many were forbidden even the basic luxury of water, forcing them to instead drink seawater, making their already frail situation arguably much worse. When they reached their holding camps, these exhausted prisoners were put to work immediately, with the average workday lasting for 10 to 12 hours, and it going up as high as 14 to 15 hours on the days they were under like Allied air attacks. On these days, the prisoners were subjugated to excruciating labor while being reminded by the Japanese, quote, "Your Churchill and Roosevelt did this." Sorry, Japanese people. In an attempt to like get them to defect to the other side, which I would say is a very valid point because we know from POWs under Nazi Germany who had to face discrimination from other European soldiers, their former allies who refused to fraternize with the Indians or even officers just because of the color of their skin, with the few moments of goodwill towards them coming from the Soviets, who themselves were considered to be subhuman by the Europeans at the time. A huge reason that the soldiers under Japanese custody made it back to their homes were the officers who refused to defect to the Imperial Army. Now, these men made sure that the juniors had some form of organization despite the imprisonment and were at the forefront of conducting strikes aimed to marginally better the condition of their fellow men. Among them was one, Captain Nirpal Chand, and this is from an article in the Times of India. Captain Chand had helped the soldiers draft an appeal to the Imperial Army asking for more suitable work hours and nutrition, among other things. These demands, as expected, were denied by the Japanese, after which Captain Chand organized a hunger strike that kept going strong despite constant threats of violent suppression. Their demands were ultimately met in order to calm the striking soldiers, however, it didn't last long. Once some sense of normalcy in terms of the slave labor in the camp was achieved, the Japanese summarily executed Captain Chand on charges of trying to incite a rebellion. I'm going to read his last words, which come to us via testimony by Jemdar Chint Singh. Quote, "Don't worry if I'm killed. Some of you will see the good times which are ahead of us and tell your tales. The Japs cannot finish the whole lot. If I die for your rightful demands, I shall consider it a great honor and credit to me." The Japanese would declare that Captain Chand was honorably executed on the 22nd of April 1944. However, many eyewitness testimonies claim that it took at least 2 strikes to his neck before he went down. Now, the same Times of India article tells us the story of another, Captain Mateen Ahmad Ansari. Now, apart from being a KCIO, that is a King's Commissioned Indian Officer, Captain Ansari was also the nephew of the Nizam of Hyderabad. A fact that he probably tried to keep hidden because that was not something you want to come out while under like foreign custody. Anyways, he was arrested on the 1st of April in 1943 on charges of trying to escape from a camp that he was already held in, along with a few of his men. On being detained, his royal lineage would also be discovered by the Japanese. Soon after, they would get to the task of trying to make Captain Ansari defect, hoping to land a huge blow to his soldiers, that is, fellow men, and also his royal house's morale, who are ultimately supplying the British, or at least helping them with the war effort in some ways. However, Captain Ansari wasn't among those who broke easy. Despite a daily routine of torture that included beatings, electric shocks, and water cure, which is a form of punishment where the victim is made to forcibly drink massive quantities of water, which I don't think is a pleasant experience. Like, I haven't personally experienced that, but I can vouch for it. Now, Captain Ansari never broke his oath to the army or his men. On finding the task of making this product of luxury break quite harder than they had anticipated, Like, you have to consider from the Japanese point of view, because up till this point, apart from their own nobles, the only contact that the or most of the contact they had with foreign nobles were like people who were massively incompetent. Like, you can think of Tsar Nicholas of Russia, who spent a good chunk of his youth in Japan, and he wasn't the most competent or intimidating figure. So then there is also Emperor Puyi, the last monarch of the Qing dynasty, who was at this time under Japanese custody, committing their war crimes for them. Like, he had no morals about being a puppet ruler and making the lives of his own people terrible. Like, that's the impression the Japanese have about royals in general. So when they found out that breaking him might not be as easy as breaking other royals, the Japanese also started to starve him while maintaining the horrific torture routine. However, that too failed to break the captain's will. Ultimately, the Japanese decided to pursue the charges of attempting to escape custody and gave Captain Ansari the choice to either be beheaded or shot. And his reply is the reason I included his story in the script. Quote, "Beheading is a barbarous method, but as you are barbarians at heart, you will have to decide." Shortly after which he was beheaded. And I can't think of a more fitting response to a group of people that are functioning on the belief that they are somehow superior and better to the barbarians that surround them. Now, along with these, many POWs that survived the war testify against Japanese brutality, including claims of Indian POWs being used as target practice for new Imperial Army recruits. And this is a thing that happened all across Japanese occupied lands. Along with these came accusations of cannibalism, which can't be proven, at least in the Indian context, because we don't have the data. But it was something the Japanese have been accused of in all lands they've occupied. So there's that. Then there's another additional thing of Japanese officers chopping down the heads of Indian soldiers. Like, this was something that happened in Nanking, of course, and the Japanese media reported on it, like extensively reported on it, and they didn't report on it as if it were a war crime or one of the things that happened during war, but no, they reported on it as if it were a sports event or something of the effect. The way that we keep down scores, that's how they track down which officer had the most skills or which officer has the most heads chopped off. So there's accusations, I could say. There's accusations from the Indian soldiers who were under Japanese custody that the same thing happened to our men. Now, you would think that the civilians might have had it better, but unfortunately, this is history, and barely do things look good like for the non-combatants. So, Japanese forces land on the southern islands of the Andaman in March 1942, which at this point wasn't a major defensive position, but rather an outpost for the cellular jail. The Japanese quickly took over the entire chain of islands with little to no resistance, and it seemed that the locals had finally been freed from the brutal clutches of European imperialism. Many of whom just eagerly waited for the Japanese on the shores of the island while screaming, "Jaldi aa jao, yahan koi British nahi hai." Meaning, like, come ashore, there's no British on this island, just come. What they failed to realize immediately was that they had just welcomed the barbarians inside their gates itself. So, locals got their first taste of Japanese brutality just a few days into their occupation of the islands. Since this was a very sparsely defended island chain, supply chains had not been yet established, as there wasn't an urgency to do so. They obviously had a good amount of arms and ammunitions, but the food situation was either here or there. So the soldiers did what soldiers do in occupied lands and looted the inhabitants of the islands. In a group of Japanese soldiers, they sneaked into a farm where they were in the process of stealing some chickens. However, a young man named Zulfikar Ali, the owner of said farm, was on the scene and shot an air gun into the general direction of the Japanese. Now, this was enough to scare them off, and in the moment it seemed like a local had bravely taken a stand and defeated a colonial power for the time being. However, the Japanese came back with guns and men, all fired up with the fury in their eyes to discipline this kid who had decided not just to silently partake in his own oppression. On getting a hint of this, Ali fled from the village, but the Japanese entered the home of his neighbors, setting aside the men, manhandling the women, and looting anything they fancied. After burning down nearly half the village, they were done for the day and promised even more carnage were the boy not handed over to them the next time they arrived. Ali made the choice to hand himself over to the Japanese in order to avoid further harm to his neighbors. When he was taken into custody, the young boy was dragged into the center of a playground, mercilessly beaten up, and then shot in the head. as everyone else kept watching. This last detail gets even more depressing if we are to believe an alternate version of the story, where Ali shot his airgun at the soldiers in order to prevent them from harassing the women in his village. A memorial to this young braveheart still stands at the spot to this day, and if any of you are going to visit Port Blair, then please do visit Zulfikar Ali's grave or his memorial, whatever it is, because I read up that it's not in the tip top condition it used to be once. So remember Zulfikar Ali and people like him. The few who did try to stand up for the fellow Indians were met with even harsher punishments, like the example of Dr. Devan Singh. Dr. Singh was a medical professional in the Azad Hind Sena and also the local leader of the Indian Independence League based in the Andamans. His life story comes to us from localite testimonies put together by his son Mohinder Singh Dhillon. Now, I think Mohinder Singh Dhillon is quite a credible source because he has also been associated with the Punjab government and in its education department in specific. So I guess as credible as it can be. In 1943, after the Zulfikar Ali incident and the constant encroachment by Japanese forces into the daily lives of the Andamanese people, Dr. Singh felt that it is his responsibility to report these issues to the puppet governor appointed by the Japanese. When he did, Singh was arrested under spying charges and sent to languish in the Andaman cellular jail. The very same hellhole which just a few months ago was a symbol of triumph over colonial forces. Many also suspect the spying charges were just pre-built resentment the Japanese held towards him, as he had previously protested the Japanese trying to lodge the Korean comfort woman into Port Blair Gurudwara, a Gurudwara that he himself had started. Singh would face a brutal torture routine for nearly 82 days, most of which he spent suspended from the ceiling, not tied to ropes, mind you. But since he was a Sikh and had to maintain long hair, they tied him up on the ceiling by his own hair. Quote, a parallel of this is difficult to find in human history. He was hung by his hair from the ceiling. At other occasions, his ankles were tied up. Water was pumped through his mouth and nostrils, and he was tied to a stake. And his bones were crunched and subjected to electric shocks, said Mohinder Dhillon, Singh's son, who collected testimonials about his father from the localites. Quote, fire was burned under his thighs, nails pulled from his fingers and toes, flesh from various parts of his body was pulled daily, and he was forced to sit on a charcoal stove. His eyeballs were gouged, but the Japanese failed to break his spirit. It was around this time, that is December 29, 1943, that Subhash Chandra Bose finally visited the islands and was given a general tour around Port Blair. During his entire stay, he was obviously under close Japanese supervision, with them monitoring where he could go and when he could go to those places. He also got a tour of the former cellular jail that I believe he viewed on with pride, as the former prison complex used to jail Indian revolutionaries and his fellow comrades themselves. So he was completely aware that prison block 6 at the same time was overcrowded with people like Dr. Singh who was suffering the same fate or even worse than what the Indians did under the British. On the 30th, Bose addressed a mass rally where for the first time the Indian tricolour was raised on Indian soil. The following day he would leave, and I can't think of a more apt metaphor that describes the country. 14 days after Bose left the island, Dr. Devan Singh would succumb to his suffering in January of 1944. These are the atrocities committed on individuals, and the Japanese were no better when it came to the treatment of towards a collective. During the process of the torture and death of Devan Singh, nearly 2,000 members of the Indian Independence League were taken in by the Japanese on spying charges and were either executed or put into the cellular jail, which is as good as being executed. The mistreatment of civilians ramped up severely after these people were silenced. They would often practice mass deportations of the islanders to other uninhabited islands, sometimes for punishments, mostly for amusement. One such instance was when 236 residents of Andaman were deported to a then deserted Havelock Island. With no food and saline soil not suitable for agriculture, there was very little these people could do to survive, and most of them, as you guessed, didn't. Of the 236 sent there, only 13 were found alive at war's end in 1945. This story has a bittersweet ending, that is, if the death of nearly 220 people was not bitter enough for you already. 8 Japanese soldiers, including one vice admiral, were hanged for this incident post-World War II. So some form of justice had been served. The bitter part is that today, Havelock is a resort island. So Fun holidays basking in the sun on an island whose first inhabitants were probably people starving to death. Now, the reason this is not mainstream in our country is one, because half the world thinks kindly of the Japanese since they were like bombed into oblivion by the US and its allies. Two, because we Indian people don't care about casualty counts anymore. That's something that's very common with us. We only care about the partition because it was a religious atrocity and not just a human atrocity. However, the biggest and I think the most important reason is how good the Japanese were at destroying documents. The rape of Andaman was not brought up during the military tribunal for the East, and Japanese war crimes on Indian soil never gained legal recognition at the international level. In the last year of the war, the situation of the Japanese station at Andaman was horrendous to say the least. We did mention that since it wasn't a strategically important position from the start, the garrison there wasn't as well supplied as it should have been. Since the Japanese were driven out of the northeastern borders of India and Myanmar eventually, that is Burma back then, the situation obviously got way worse. The Japanese found the solution to this in more cruelty towards the natives. Many were deported to uninhabited islands in order to grow food for the soldiers. Needless to say, these excursions ended in misery for the civilians. Finally, on the 14th of August, Emperor Hirohito had realized that the war had no other end other than the total capitulation of Japan and possibly his imperial status as well. To preserve the latter, he drafted up an announcement of surrender which was published to the world the next day. So, 15th August is when the Andaman and Nicobar Islands were handed back to the British, with Lieutenant Colonel Nathu Singh accepting the surrender. The total death toll of the occupation is like hard to calculate, again due to meticulous destruction of documents. But the Andamanese themselves estimate the number to be as high as 20,000 people. Obviously, the real number is somewhere in the 2 to 3,000 range, as the census that took place in 1941 and 1951 indicate. This is still a massive number, nearly 10% of its population back then. To put this into perspective, that's more than 4 times the casualties caused by the 26/11 attacks and the 1993 bombings combined. Japan has obviously never apologized for this, and as far as I know, our government did not seem to care much either. So that's about that. That's that. How the people of Andamans and Nicobar suffered under Japanese rule, and as it is with anything that is not Central India, we just don't care. It didn't happen to Indians. So, bye.